Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Morris. I'm the board president of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's program featuring Haroon Ullah, who'll be speaking on the topic, How Do We Stop the Next World War? The Weaponization of Information and the Fight for Cybersecurity. First, of course, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Wilbraham and Munson Academy, Sir Speedy, and a special thanks to NAI Plotkin, the managers of 1350 Main Street, who make this space available to us. And of course, thanks always to Sid Melcher, our executive director, for setting this whole thing up. Thank you, Sid. I also want to greet the members of our board of directors who are here today. Megan Lungi, there in the back hiding. Rich Rediker up in the front. John Young, who was helping you out register, and our immediate past president, Gary Breton. Gary, hello. And I also want to have special thanks and welcome to Bob Fry from Holyoke High School and his contingent of students. It is so good to see you there. We enjoyed our event that we had last year at Holyoke High School, and it's good to see Holyoke High School students here again. I'll say a few words about our upcoming programs. I particularly draw your attention to Wednesday, February 28th. We're having one of our adventures in international dining at the Palette Restaurant. There are copies of information about that on the table outside the door. It's the one in sort of shocking purple color sheet. We'll give you more information about that. Also, so an event I know we are all looking forward to. On Tuesday, March 20th, we will be having a talk from Ambassador Mark Hambley. And I think most of you are familiar with Ambassador Hambley and what fine presentations he will give. He'll be talking about developments in the Arabian Peninsula. And then another event I think should be very, very good. On Thursday, April 12th, Dr. Harry Dumais, the new president of Elms College, will be speaking to us about Haiti, international development, and education right here at One Financial Plaza. And then a new event that's coming up this year for the first time, and I would urge all of you to try to make it for this. On Sunday, May 6th, we are going to be having our first Global Trivia Challenger fundraiser. This is a quiz intended for adults to test your knowledge of world affairs and world knowledge. It will be emceed by Peter Sokolowski from Merriam-Webster. And if you've ever seen Peter MC an event, you know that you'll be in for a treat for all of that. So there's a sheet again about all of this, and please consider attending all of those. I also will make a quick pitch for membership in the World Affairs Council. If you are not already, I would urge you to consider becoming a member. It is the best way to be kept up to date on all of the events that we're doing, and it's, of course, your opportunity to support the good work of the World Affairs Council. Just a brief comment on one other topic, and perhaps you saw Sid's tweet on this, but if you didn't see it, I will point out that yesterday was our 92nd birthday. 92nd, yes. It was the 92nd anniversary of the first meeting of what was then the Connecticut Valley chapter of the Foreign Policy Association. This was this group that was established in part, quote, to make Americans see our stake in international affairs and to urge upon them the necessity of founding their convictions upon information, not prejudice and propaganda. Timely thought for us, particularly as we'll be hearing in the talk we're about to hear. The year was 1926, and there were more than 300 people at that event. They attended a luncheon at the Hotel Kimball, and it featured a debate about fascism in Italy between James P. Rowe from New York City in favor and Professor William W. Elliott of Harvard University arguing against. The event caused quite a stir here in Springfield, people thinking that the whole thing was a put-up job by Mussolini. But One of the very interesting offshoots of that is that Professor Elliott, who was the anti-fascist speaker, went on to serve as a mentor for one of his students, who was Henry Kissinger, and also became a State Department advisor during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, thus establishing the pattern of our council attracting illustrious speakers as we have today. So on that happy note, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Haroon Ullah, Chief Strategy Officer for the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Haroon is a former senior advisor to the U.S. Department of State with a special portfolio on digital transmedia strategy and countering violent extremism. He's also an award-winning author, a Peabody TV Award recipient, adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. For those of you with good memories, you recall that Haroon spoke to us about 4 years ago about his last book, The Bargain and the Bazaar, The Bargain from the Bazaar, A Family's Day of Reckoning in Lahore, about political violence in Pakistan. He's also the author of Vying for Allah's Vote, Understanding Islamic Parties, Political Violence, and Extremism in Pakistan. And he's here today to speak to us about his newest book, Digital World War, for which we have copies on sale thanks to Odyssey Bookstore. And my only caution there is we're not taking credit cards today, so please cash or check if you would like to buy the book. The new book has been praised by Walter Isaacson, who's certainly one of my favorite authors, and also by Marine Corps General John R. Allen, who was the former special presidential envoy to the Global Coalition to counter ISIL. And General ISIL describes Haroon as, quote, a key figure in waging digital conflict with those who would traffic in terror, disinformation, and hatred, and also, quote, one of the central figures in waging digital war against the so-called Islamic State. So with that, please welcome Haroon Ullah.
Thrilled to be here, and you guys have a fantastic council. I love coming here. This is my second home to come up to Boston. As Sid knows, I lived for a number of years, almost 10 years, here in New England and Boston. Went to school here. My wife went to school here. She went to Wellesley. So any excuse to come here. You have a fantastic leadership, and I've known Sid for a long time. So I'm really thrilled to be here to have this conversation about a subject that I'm really passionate about. And that is this idea of what's going on this information battlefield. And when I say information battlefield, I'm talking about social media, I'm talking about how we get our information on our phones, I'm talking about what we watch on TV or what we watch on our computer screens, but this idea of the weaponization of information. And to me, this is the sort of the new frontier that has already dawned upon us in terms of the types of struggles, both to keep America safe and the types of things that I think are changing the way foreign policy, international relations. I think this, to me, is the key component. And I think for many of us that follow the news, you can't go without hearing something about the Russian disinformation campaign or what ISIS is doing, the so-called Islamic State or Daesh, what they're doing online, or what the Chinese are doing in different spheres. So to me, this is, but to understand it, and I've tried to spend some time understanding it, it doesn't come intuitively. It's something that it is taking me some time to wrap my head around, what is this space? Because it's very different. And that's what I want to share with you today, which led to my book and also my own work. And to start my own story, although this is my second home, I grew up in rural America. So I grew up actually on the other side of the country in eastern Washington state. And, I want to start there because it sort of explains to you why this subject became of interest to me. So I grew up near, as for many might remember, the Manhattan Project. My dad was a nuclear engineer, worked for Department of Energy, and he worked at a place called Hanford, Washington. Does anyone know where Hanford, Washington is? It's like growing up in The Simpsons. It's where we have 5 nuclear reactors, and I grew up in a small rural part of eastern Washington. But I grew up there, and in a lot of ways, I was curious about, people would oftentimes ask me, they would say, Haroon, what's going on? At that time, it's like, what's going on in Iraq? think about now what's going on in Iraq, the same question. But this is years ago. People asked me, what's going on in Iraq? And I didn't have a good answer. Look, I grew up in there. I hadn't traveled at all. But they thought maybe, they weren't sure where I was from. So they were like, maybe you might know. You might be from somewhere in the Middle East. I'm like, no. I grew up in East Richland. I love country music. I drive a truck. All true, by the way. And so, but it planted a seed of curiosity. And so I ended up traveling for almost the next 20 years. So I did my doctoral work abroad. I lived in South Asia for a number of years. I served as a diplomat, both at our embassies in Islamabad and Kabul. And I lived in the Middle East, in Morocco, in Lebanon, and in Syria, and many places. And part of my journey was trying to make sense of, at that time, I didn't think of it as an information battlefield, but that's what it was. So one of my projects that I worked on was I went to northern part of Pakistan and Afghanistan to the border. And I wanted to understand why young people, right, would join al-Qaeda camps or join the Taliban. Why would a young 15-year-old kid that grew up in a small town not too different than where I grew up from, why would they get up and go and join one of these groups? And so I went into these camps to interview them. I wanted to understand what was their journey. What was it? Because to me, to combat this extremism, you have to understand it. You have to understand it, what drives young people to do that, and then you can design strategies to how to combat it. And when I was living in Pakistan, that's where I want to start with you today. I was working there at the embassy. This is back in 2011, and I was having lunch with one of my contacts, a journalist. So I had a great lunch. Anyone here been to Pakistan? I think you've been to Pakistan in the back. Yeah, we have a couple people from Pakistan. Okay. So I was in Islamabad, which is the capital, and I was having lunch with a journalist, and we had a great sort of conversation. And for anyone that spends time in Pakistan, because of the sort of troubled history that we've had there over the years, the intelligence services are everywhere. So their intelligence service is called the ISI, and I knew they were following me. So I'd send coffee or, as they say, tea out to the guy that was watching me. It's not his fault. He just has doing his job. So you pick up on sort of a little bit of spycraft, but you sort of try to become friends with them. But I was rushing back. So I had lunch and I rushed back to the embassy. And at that time, we had my BlackBerry. And I was like, I don't even know why I was rushing. I was speeding. I was trying to get back to the embassy. And oftentimes the embassy we think are more important than we actually are. But I was trying to get there on time. And I hit this massive traffic jam. And what I realized is that we sat there for 5 minutes, nothing happened. 10 minutes, nothing happened. Finally, I got out of the car and I asked people, what's going on? And I realized right where I had lunch, there was a former governor of Punjab. His name was Salman Taseer. He had been just gunned down. He'd been shot 26 times. Okay? And I'd known him and his family. It was obviously very jarring to just find out. And I was just having lunch in the restaurant right next door. And a member of his security detail had gunned him down. Now, in those days afterward and the weeks afterwards, I sort of wanted to explore how did this happen? And this leads me to what I want to talk to you about today. What I realized when I was starting to look into some of the research is that he had gotten what I call sort of virtual beheadings. There were a lot of groups that were online at that time that were taking some of his talks and they were cutting out little snippets and making videos of what he said, taking what he said out of context, because he spoke up about freedom of religious minorities, he spoke about women's rights, he spoke about sort of a lot of issues that weren't popular with a lot of the extremists. And so they were trying to target him. And I remember talking to him, and he said, look, this is just noise. These people, what they're doing online, I'm used to it. He was a public figure. He'd been well known. He had operated. But what I started to realize was that this world, what we called online and what we think of as offline, was starting to blur. Because what happened is a member of his security detail ends up seeing one of these videos, one of these snippets of these videos online, and they were rabid. It was like now we talk about disinformation. This was a disinformation campaign, right? They were taking stuff out of context. They were saying things that he said that weren't actually true. But back then, we didn't have any fact checkers to sort of figure out. And a member of his security detail read that, and within 2 days decided, I'm going to take this into my own hands, and I'm going to take out this person that I think is against the Pakistani sort of nationalism, against the Pakistani state, right? And that, for me, was the first thing that hit close to home. I had done a lot of research on extremist groups. And anyone know why extremist groups were online before anyone else? Like in the AOL chat rooms, if you remember the American Online chat rooms, or STP, or if you think about right when the advent of, and people don't remember that noise when we dialed up to AOL online, right? Well, they were online because a lot of groups, that was the only place they could go to congregate. So they had what we think of as first mover advantage. So they used to go there because they were censored in other places. So that was a safe space for them to go and to congregate. So they started using technology before others because it was a way for them to communicate because they were banned or they were censored. And so they actually moved into those spaces early on, which is sort of ironic. So that planted a seed to me many years ago. And I want to fast forward to today. My approach has always been to combine. Look, I'm a small town kid, so I think of I always want to understand, I want to get inside someone's head. I want to understand their customer journey. So I try to look at qualitative, what is it that makes them go in one direction? But I also have a very strong quantitative background. I did my doctoral work in game theory, right? And here at the Kennedy School of Government, and I spent many years here doing research. And for me, it was trying to combine both of these. And so in my book, I try to understand, you get a lot of anecdotes of why young people are joining ISIS, but I wanted to see from a data-driven perspective, what is that? And one of the first steps I did was I built a database of defectors. So what's a defector? How would we define a defector? Yes? Exactly. So it's somebody that went there, maybe they're from Western Europe, maybe they're from the US, maybe they're from other parts of the Middle East. They got up, they bought a ticket, they went to Syria, they went to Iraq for one reason or another. They found themselves in ISIS. By the way, majority of people that ended up going there didn't go there to join ISIS. They went there to fight against Assad, which is interesting. So you can think about what pulled people there. They ended up going to ISIS because of, they felt like they had the strongest organization on the ground, or they lured them in when they were there. So I built up this database of about 900 defector stories because I want to understand what are the commonalities between all these young people that are going. And about 2 years ago, I'm sitting in the Gulf in Dubai, and I interviewed a lot of them. So I want to interview them. And my first question to this young gentleman named Jamil was the following. I wanted to start off with this question just saying, tell me one word. Describe ISIS to me in one word. All right? And I'm talking to him, and I'm thinking in Arabic, what is he going to respond to me? In my head, I already know what I think he's going to say. This is a defector, by the way. So he was disenchanted. He had left. He had had a bad experience. Okay? And I'm thinking he's going to say things like dark, murderers, hypocrites. That's what I was sort of thinking. But he starts telling me something very different. He says trust. He says belonging. He says identity. Okay? And in my head, I'm thinking, what's the disconnect here? How can we be looking at the same thing? Am I not looking at the right? Am I just missing something here because I'd read a lot about it? I've been studying it. And as I dug into this, I realized, yes, I was missing a lot here. And that's what I want to share with you today. What was it that I was missing in my analysis? And so that's why I wanted to share with you kind of a couple of key points about what is on this information battlefield. And again, how does it pose? How can we, one, understand it better? And how can we keep ourselves safe? Because I'm very much a policy person. I worked, I had the sort of I think of it sort of a humble honor of being able to work for 3 secretaries of state. Most recently, I was on Secretary Tillerson's staff. So I've seen up close like policy making from different angles. But I always think about what's actionable. What can we do together that actually can tackle this? Not just sort of think about it, sort of analysis paralysis, but what can we actually do? So one of the key things that came out as I was thinking about this disconnect with Jamil is this idea that speed kills. So that's the first thing I want to share with you today. So this idea that speed kills. All right. Anyone want to guess? What do I mean by that? Speed kills. Other than that's a mantra that Bill Belichick uses for, putting out, oh, they should have won the Super Bowl. We'll talk about that later. Yeah. Right. Okay. Good. Yeah. It's it's a rapid change, right? You want to move quickly. What else? Yes. Yes. Exactly. So speed of electronic messaging. We actually measure this. So what do we mean by electronic messaging is that before we used to think of it like in terms of press releases. I send out a press release, and you could track how many people got the press release and how long, right? And there's different, actually, you would attach a certain time, a coefficient. Maybe it takes half a day, or maybe it took an hour. Now we actually measure the instantaneous of getting a message out, how many people will actually get that message, right? So let me build out this idea of what speed kills. So what we find out is that groups like ISIS, not just non-state actors, but state actors like the Russians or the Chinese, what they've recognized is that they've recognized first mover advantage. So first mover advantage means that if you're the first one to get out your narrative or to get out information, right? If you can beat others to getting out that information, you've already have a head start in that fight. So what do I mean by that? So if you think about the case of Salman Taseer, what I mentioned in Pakistan, they were setting the narrative, the sort of online bullies, these people that were extremists using online, they had already set the narrative about him that he was against the national state in Pakistan, that he was against, they had taken some of his things out of context, but they had sent that to everybody. Now, by the time people went back and looked at the fact checking, it was too late because they had already set the narrative, right? So they recognize that getting your message out first is key, right? And so when you think about groups like ISIS, right? They will sometimes put out 50 to 60,000 pieces of content a day. Okay? What I mean by content: memes, videos, tweets, messages, emails, right? All sorts of what we think of in terms of how do you get information out to somebody, right? That was at its height. It's gone down over time. But they recognize that they're pushing out information. They've lowered the cost of information, right? And here's the other thing that comes when you think about speed kills. It's not about reaching everybody. That's sort of a misnomer. We think they want to reach everybody, right? But they don't want to reach everybody. They have a mantra which they live by. And this is a mantra on this new information battlefield. This is what, if you think of a governing principle, this is what it is. The narrower the audience, the bigger the impact. The narrower the audience, the bigger the impact. So the better you can be about sort of being very laser focused about who you want to reach, the bigger impact you are. So it's not about reaching everybody in terms of the masses. And this is the question I start off with Jamil. This is where I realized where one of the disconnects were. So I was reading a lot of the propaganda in what? What language do you think? I do read Arabic, but I was reading it in English, right? I was reading it in English. So I was reading it in English, even though I could speak Urdu and Arabic. I was kind of looking through a lot of the gruesome videos, the beheadings, the sort of, a lot of the sort of blood and gore, a lot of things that they do, right? What I recognized is that, hold on a second, when I went to read things in Arabic, I realized their messaging was completely different. So what Jamil was reading was completely different. In fact, what Jamil was reading, 80% of that material that he was reading is what we would consider positive messaging. Okay? It was considered positive messaging, meaning it was like Nutella and kittens. It was like, this is a club med for foreign fighters. They were talking about governance. They were talking about corruption. They were talking about giving out food to those that didn't have, this is what they were talking about in Arabic, right? So then I started to recognize that, wait a minute, they understand audience architecture better than I ever thought, right? And as I started going through it, I realized, wait a minute, English is not even in the top 5 languages of what they're messaging in. hold on a second. It's not even in the top 5. Anyone want to guess what's in the top 5 after Arabic? What else? I'm talking about volume of messaging that a group like ISIS is doing. Yep, Russian. No, that's close, that's good. It's Dari, French, and Urdu. So it tells you, interesting, who they're trying to reach. English is not even in the top 5. So all of a sudden I recognize, wait a minute, they're saying one thing in Arabic, and they're saying something very different in English. They're saying one thing in French, and they're saying something very different in Russian. So what they had realized, as a lot of, you could think of like sort of Fortune 500 companies, is that all sort of, their messaging was all local. You know, as I think of it, as we talk about all politics are local, well, all radicalization is local. So they were speaking to people individually, very narrow audiences, and that's where they were having the big impact. And they were segmenting things in a very different way, right? They had understand this world of what we call audience architecture, which is, again, how to reach somebody in their own language, in their own stories, that's authentic, that speaks to them. And just on a headline, if you take a step back, a lot of the stuff in English was meant to instill fear, was to scare, right? It was to show the sort of gruesome side. And that had its designed effect too. They wanted to scare all of us. They wanted to make them seem to see they're so brutal and gruesome. But then they wanted to show a very different face to the people that they were trying to recruit, right? And so you start thinking about how they're doing their messaging, how they're doing their storyboarding. But the first point I wanted to get at was speed kills, that this idea of first mover advantage. Now, I'll talk a little bit later on if we get into question and answers, but this also plays into the new technology, which is, we hear a lot about artificial intelligence, machine learning, some of the computational tactics that the Russians are using, the Chinese are using, that ISIS is using. So this same principle I talked about, now you see how it plays out. When we talk about speed kills, when they get a message out, let's say they send out a tweet saying, let's say the tweet is something simple. It shows a bushel of apples and it says, the caliphate is bountiful, okay? That actually, by the way, doesn't violate any terms of service on Twitter or Facebook or on Google or any of the tech companies, okay? Just a picture of apples, and all you say is the caliphate is bountiful, okay? Now what they do is they have these bots. They have this computational, so the bots then double down and they scale up to try to increase the activity, right, of getting that message out. It's an automation, right? So it's just automated to getting it out to people. So all of a sudden now you have first mover advantage. You have these machines that are essentially getting material out to people, and the rate at which these machines are getting better at picking up information is, some studies say that within 2 to 3 years, majority of our interaction online will be with machines. Right? There's some studies that say between 2 to 5 years, they're picking up, we think we're talking to somebody who's a real persona, but actually it's a bot that is modeling the behavior of somebody. They take their real profile, they take their name, they take they have the attributes. You couldn't tell, right? So this is this idea of speed kills, right? So now all of a sudden, with 5,000, and that's it. Some of their fanboys are only about 5,000. It's not a lot. But with the small, nimble fanboys, right, think about the impact now, right? With this computational piece of it, boy, they're able to recruit people from 60 different countries. They're able to recruit up to 30,000 people from all over the world to come, right? So you think about, the scale of their operations, and it's quite large, okay? The second thing I wanted to talk to you about is this idea of audience matters, right? So we talked a lot about audience architecture, but they really think through on this information battlefield, how do you reach somebody? What is it that is, quote unquote, in their interests? So how do you delve down deep into understanding? So I like to the way to think about this is, let's say on Twitter in the Middle East, anyone want to guess, if anybody follows, does anyone want to guess the number one person on Twitter in the Middle East? You don't want to guess? No? Yeah, no, I was saying somebody who's from the region, right? Not someone from here. Well, an interesting corollary, although I'm not going to make exact correlate, as we know that Billy Graham passed away today, and you think about the importance of religious leaders, right? And he was an icon in many ways. Well, the biggest person on Twitter in the Middle East is also a religious leader, but this religious leader is an extremist cleric based in Saudi Arabia, right? So if you think about this, the biggest person on Twitter, it's not, it's not a sports icon, it's not a politician, it's not a musician. By the way, religious leaders, bless his heart, but Billy Graham only had like 400,000 followers on Twitter, right? So it's not, even though he's well known and things like that, in the U.S. we know who the biggest. It's like, Justin Bieber. It's, if you think about who's the biggest people on social media followings, but the biggest person on Twitter in the Middle East is someone named Mohammed Al-Arafi. He has nearly 20 million followers. Okay, and just to give you perspective, he sits right underneath. If you think about the top followers, Twitter followers globally, he sits at number 58, right under Ed Sheeran, right above Hillary Clinton, in terms of number of Twitter followers. All right. Now, why is this person important? Interestingly enough, if you talk to folks in D.C. or here in Boston, in Springfield, if you go to New York, most people haven't heard of him. But the interesting thing is that this person is probably the single biggest driver of why young people, I talked about that database I put together, this was the common thread. People talked about watching his material because he's not just prolific on Twitter, he's prolific on Snapchat, he's prolific on all these new platforms, he's on Facebook, right? He doesn't violate terms of service, but he is a fanboy. He guides people in the direction of wanting to join. Yes?
How does he not violate terms of service?
It's a good question. So he does things that he does things that, for example, I'll give you an example. He takes that famous Robert Frost poem, The Road Not Taken, okay? All he does is he shows a picture of a road, and he says, this is the path to success. That's it, right? If you think about it, it's sort of general, but for a lot of people reading it, they understand the subtext of what he's trying to say, right? He's trying to get them to do a change narrative. Exactly, right? So he's not putting up flags of ISIS saying, here's where you should do, right? Because that would violate terms of service. So he does things, and he does these 8-second like religious rulings, right? Sitting in his car on Snapchat for those that use Snapchat. So he's prolific on these things. The why I mention him is because this is part of the network, right? Of people that are influential, that are amplifying the message. So once you get the message out, you have people like him that are amplifying this message. And even though he's in the vast, vast minority, he's a third-rate sort of preacher that never would have made it. But he's realized he can go straight to the consumer and bypass. He never could have graduated of higher learning. He would have never qualified. But he's able to go straight. He's sort of a YouTube phenomena, if you think of him that way, right? But it tells you the power of this information battlefield, that it can take somebody literally unknown, right? And that person can come straight to becoming the most followed. Now, think about this. He can't come to the US. He can't travel to Europe. He's banned to most countries, including the US. He's banned to going to Europe. But you know what? He doesn't need to. And you know why? Because there's no borders on this information battlefield. There's no borders. He actually doesn't need to travel because he's able to get his message out to people using these platforms. And he's able to, what I say, and this gets at another point that I wanted to get across to you, is that he shows what we call platform agility. Platform agility, meaning, look, we might talk about Facebook and Twitter, right? But groups out there have moved way beyond. There are new applications I can't even pronounce that they're using. One of them is called Saraha. Anyone use Saraha? You guys use Saraha? No? I thought maybe you might use Saraha. So Saraha now is the number one application, number one app in 25 countries. It's being downloaded more than Snapchat. Young people all around the world are using it. A lot of parents in the US hate it because their kids are using it. And it was designed as an app to to provide sort of feedback, honest feedback. The best way I can think about it, look, I come from from small town. So it's like what we have in our high school bulletin board. right? Like, I don't know, Jimmy's shorts stink, right? You know, you put that up on the board. Like, it was meant to be a place where you could give honest feedback in a workplace or school environment. That's what it was designed for, right? Obviously, the person that designed it, they had good intentions. But then all these other groups have started using it, right, to basically do cyberbullying. And now groups like ISIS are recruiting on it. The Russians are using it, right, to spread disinformation. The platform itself was not meant for that, just like Facebook was not meant for that, or Twitter was not meant for that. But now, all of a sudden, these groups have mastered you using that. There's another app called Riot, which is, you know, I can go way into the technology, but it shows end-to-end encryption. It's sort of what we think of WhatsApp, if you use WhatsApp, or you know, if you've heard of Telegram. But the reason I mention it is just that there are all these new applications, and these groups are now proficient at using them, right? And you can tell the lag cycle, right? Look, just think of this image, because I live in DC. It was, if you remember, last fall, we had the technology executives, right, from Facebook, Google, and Twitter were testifying, right, on the Hill, in the Senate. They were testifying about why, and the subject that we're talking about now, this weaponization of information, how are the Russians, how are ISIS and others using their platforms? Why weren't they doing more to take this content out of their ecosystems, right, which is important, so they were talking about it. But if you just take a step back, if you look at when ISIS and the Russians were using this, you go back to 2013, 2014, it's not new, right? But it's 3 years later now we're talking about it and decided to take measures. Well, you know what? Like, we've already lost to some extent, because ISIS 3.0 is already out there. We're not even talking about it, right? Think about this. If you think of, like, let's say, think about extremist groups. If you think of the Taliban as in like elementary school, and Al-Qaeda as in like sort of junior high, well, ISIS was in college. And ISIS 3.0 is already in grad school. But if you're thinking about it, we're not moving at that pace to sort of think about how do we prepare for that next generation, whether it's, you think about it as next generation terror. I write a lot about it in my book. I call it the Cloud Caliphate. I talk about groups. There's a group called Tahrir al-Sham that could be the next ISIS 3.0. But I mention it because we have to sort of be ahead of the curve. We're always going to be looking back, and this is the problem of, you know, in this space, is that we're sort of playing catch up, right? And I'll get into solutions because I do focus on this a lot. But just to give you one more data point to think about this, does anyone know, you know, in our military, there's what's called a cyber command. We have had a cyber command. Does anyone know when that became a unified command? Unified command, anyone? Cyber command? So our cyber command just became a unified command last August. What does a unified command mean? A unified command means that they can do end-to-end operations, fully operational. Last August, by the way, right? So you can think about just that we finally have now kind of put together, I think, you know, we need a group of like cyber SEALs, but we've now finally put together, but it's very recent. So if you think about this information battlefield, we're playing catch up. Now, I don't think it's too late to turn the tide, but a number of things have to be put into place. So I started off with speed kills, right? Audience matters, right? And here's a third point I want to leave you with, is that this idea of content wars. So if you think about this at the heart of it, what's going on online, what's going on in terms of information, it is a content war, okay? Anyone want to guess, let's say, so whether you're online or you have a smartphone. How many here have smartphones? Yeah, most of us? Okay. Anyone want to guess how many advertisements we see a day? Well, that we come across, whether we internalize it or not, right? It's about 11,500, okay? Now, you think about, what happens is that we naturally built up a filter. We have to. We can't read it. We don't read it all. It's things we see. We're bombarded with information. So even unconsciously, you know, we're filtering information, but it talks about the scale of information that's now coming to us, right? That's increasing, okay? This is what I mean by content wars. So we are being flooded with content, right? Tons and tons of content in all different forms are coming. Some of we choose it, some we don't. Some of it we're trying to block out. Some of it we would rather not see, but it just comes at us because it's sitting. If we Google something, it's on the side. Its ads pop up. These algorithms know what we want, what we don't. All of a sudden, when you're on Facebook or you're using something to just look at up a phone number, right? So all of a sudden, there's all these data that's being collected about our preferences. Right? That's what we talk about with big data. But why this is important is, again, on this information battlefield, which I think is the new frontier when we talk about this weaponization information, content are like the tanks, okay? And these are content wars. So you talk about the scale of content, right? If you think about, anyone want to guess, like, you know, so YouTube is now the second most visited website in the world, right? Anyone want to guess, like, how many hours of content are uploaded every minute? I guess. Hundreds of millions, right? Hundreds of millions uploaded every minute, right? So again, you think about this content war. So now let's think about this in the context of whether you want to talk about the Russians, the Chinese, or you want to talk about, let's say, ISIS. They're trying to put their battalions on this information battlefield, and it's about content. That's why I talked about pieces of social media, of TV. They're trying out a lot of different things. ISIS, for example, has something like a Game of Thrones type of video. They're using memes. They're using all sorts of pictures, right? So these groups are pushing out content because they know that content is the way that you convince people, you persuade people, you recruit people. It's all through content. It's a version of what we think about with the ads, with the number of ads that we say each day. But they're trying to improve their rate of us watching those things or influencing. I remember I sat with somebody. So on the Russian disinformation side, I remember I was in London, and there was a member of, I don't know if anyone's heard of RT, right? RT. So this is Russia Today, which is one of the means of how the Russians are spreading disinformation in their campaigns, right? They use these RTs become very popular globally. There's Sputnik. There's actually the Russian public broadcasting, which is kind of the multi-billion-dollar elephant in the room. But I asked this executive, and I said, what is your goal? What are you trying to do? And if you ever watch RT, you'll see that they have a certain angle that they're trying to push, right? But, I was trying to ask him, in your storyboard meetings, is there an overall principle that you guys have? He said, yes. And he smiled, and he says, it's to confuse people. That's it, to confuse, right? And one of their mottos is that there's no truth. So RT, if you see it, they have advertisements on buses and stuff. They put it in New York and in DC. The idea is there's no truth. That's actually one of their mantras, right? And the reason they're successful on this information battlefield is because on the content wars, they're giving so much content that they're successful in just getting people from one position to becoming neutral. And that's all their goal is, right? So again, when you think about influence, on one level, it's about a young person that might buy a ticket and go to Syria. But on another level, it's moving somebody that's a vulnerable youth just into that gray space. So they're not sure, right? Because then they're open for additional recruitment. They're open for other information. So I wanted to give you kind of those 3 points. Again, speed kills, audiences matter, and this idea that there's content wars. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think can be done. And then I want to open up to sort of have a conversation. So I mentioned Manhattan Project. I actually think we need something like a new Manhattan Project. Because if you think about on this information battlefield, we actually have so many inherent advantages. One is that people often tell me, we don't have the messages, we don't have the narratives. I was like, actually, we do. There's hundreds of thousands of young people that have authentic, gritty stories, right? The stories of our youth, the stories of youth all around the world that undercut the narrative of ISIS, right? We have the stories. We just need to get the stories to the right people, right? So we have those organic stories, right? So you have that's one piece of this. The other piece of it is that, look, the technology companies, we are the sort of greatest innovators, right? This is the home of Silicon Valley. We understand technology better than I think anyone else. We created those platforms. So if you talk about platform agility, we have that. And then we have also, we can put in seed money. We have resources, both in the public and private sector, right? Because this is not inexpensive. Content does cost. When you talk about content wars, creating content is not costless. Like, you have to put money into producing content. That's what others are doing. If you look at RT, they're putting in billions of dollars, right, into that. Why? Because they've recognized the importance of that on the information battlefield, right? And I work at the Broadcasting Board of Governors, where that's what we're trying to also compete on that landscape, right? We include Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Middle East Broadcasting Network, Radio Free Asia, Cuba Broadcasting, Marti. So producing content in 61 languages, over 7,000 hours of TV broadcast a day alone. So we're also trying to get that story, get America's story, talk about the values that we know are important through a variety of means to key audiences, almost 290 million people a day that we reach. But the point is that putting that all together, I think, and I talked about these three levers, is that's a little bit of a collective action problem. It's a little bit what we call tragedy of the commons. So you find that all three of these pieces we could better fit together, but we haven't been able to put it all together to pivot on this information battlefield. So I'm going to stop there and then ask if there's any questions or any thoughts. Or
I have one request. I've let Haroon go longer than I usually let speakers go because I thought he was saying such great things. He's going to be sticking around to sign books. Those of you who have questions who must leave at 1, I'd like them to be able to ask questions, and those of you who are able to hang around a little bit, if you could defer to them. But we have about 5 minutes for questions, if that's fair.
great, now. I'll take a couple. Yeah.
How do you think the print of Saudi Arabia is going to be a real leader in reform and take it up?
Yeah, good question. I'll bundle a couple of them together. That's a great question. Any other questions? Yeah. You had your hand sort of.
Sorry.
Yeah.
How do you equate your answer to that with what he's done more recently in his acquisition? So.
You mean the Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Arabia? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yes.
Did I understand you correctly that Russian developed messages that have been developed by RT are appearing on our buses in Washington and New York that say there's no truth?
Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So I'll bundle these together, and I'll start with this one first. Yes. So short answer is yes. You can get it on satellite TV. A lot of people watch it. By the way, I know a lot of people that watch and don't even know what RT stands for, because it's a bit slick, and they actually are really adept online. They do some interesting videos. They take a lot of, if you ever watch BuzzFeed, they take a lot of the principles from BuzzFeed or Vox, and they put together these really interesting videos. But yeah, they're very popular, and by people that don't even realize where it's coming from. On your questions, I'll group together. I would say that I'm worried. And the reason I'll say worried is that I'll harken back. I talked about this guy, Mohammed al-Arafi. Well, you know what? In this latest version of Saudi Sopranos, if you've been watching what's going on with all the arrests in Saudi, he's one person that went unscathed, right? And so I worry that he, who I think is one of the biggest detriments to U.S. national security, right, that we haven't articulated, if a majority of young people are joining ISIS because of the work that he's doing, well, we have to communicate that to our partners there, that they need to do a better job, right? Because he's working unhindered on the information battlefield. So I worry about that, what he's exporting sort of via online. And I think that we also have to recognize, and this is an interesting point, I'm going to try to say it succinctly, but we have to recognize the unintended consequences. When we support, obviously, dictators or monarchy rules, young people in the region look at that as they want to control their own destiny. So one of the reasons ISIS has been successful is because they look at the failed Arab Spring, when young people wanted to vote in democratic elections, and they wanted the freedom to choose who to vote for, because ISIS said, you know what, playing by the rules don't work. Playing by the rules of the game doesn't work. That's why you should come and join us. So you have to be careful about that element of it, because young people are saying, wait a minute, we want to organize, we want to protest, we want to vote in elections, we don't want dictators or monarchies. And when we don't balance our approach, we can have partnerships, but we also should be voicing support for those young people that want self-determination. Yes.
Some countries have rules about media knowingly publishing something that's false. In this country, what's the difference? I know Russia had this big disinformation campaign, but what's to stop anybody, Americans, from doing the same thing unless it's a slippery slope, have rules about the big companies knowingly publishing what's false?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to take one here.
I had two comments that I'd like you to expand on if you have
Yeah.
time. The first was, as you were describing your conversation with Jamil
Yeah.
and why, and his responses, I was hearing a member of like a gang task force in one of the big cities in America
Right.
talking about why those gang members join up.
Right.
And then the second thing is on the unified command and the delay in getting it together, was that delay due in part to the continuing bickering that goes on among the armed forces?
Yeah, and so I'll tackle that now, and then I'll weave back to your very good question. So, yes, a lot of it was like infighting among sort of in the interagency, and part of it was that I always say that look, in this information battlefield, the best work doesn't happen in D.C. We have to have what I call starfish model, which is empowering. It's almost like swarm theory, which is empowering people in the field, because as I said, this information, all information is local. You have to think of this in particular regions and markets. And so it's not a command and control like we do a press release from DC or we have cyber command, but we need to be empowering people in the field. So the good thing is it's finally unified. And now I think they're putting more emphasis on it. And for the first time in the new national security strategy, information statecraft has been elevated. So this concept of what I'm talking about, it wasn't even talked about in our national security strategies before. It's now been elevated to being talked about. So that's heartening, but we got to do more to back it up. On your point, this is a very this to me I think is going to be a really critical question going forward. Is how do news organizations deal with this idea of evaluate? I can tell you that I've spoken to some tech companies, and they were doing internal studies of trying to label content. So they were trying to rank content. Just give you an example. Let's say, I don't know, 1 being false, 10 being true. So they would rate content on some sort of algorithm, maybe 3.5 or 8.5, depending on the reputation of the publication or what the fact checkers say. Interestingly enough, they found that those that were lower scores, they drove more traffic to it. Right? Anyone want to guess why? Because for a lot of people, it was like edutainment. It was like clickbait. They want to understand what was it there, right? So inadvertently, so this question of how do you filter is going to be a huge question. How do you filter without censoring? And is it even possible, right? Because it's so, you have such a proliferation online. The one thing I worry about is that people will get so disenchanted, they'll just unplug. They'll be like, I just don't want to even deal with any of that noise because I just can't tell where it's coming from. Sid. Yes.
I think that's the ultimate goal, right? To have a populace that's disengaged. I'm looked at this tragic event that happened last Wednesday down in Florida. And almost immediately, you had both sides putting out information. You had these kids who were taking an activist role in demanding changes to our laws, but at the same time, you have a group saying that these kids are all actors and that they've been hired to, and this whole event was staged, a false flag type of incident.
Right.
And that type of information comes out immediately, and we look at it and we say, well, which one of these is true, if either of them is true?
Yeah.
And can we actually ever understand this event? And it gets people to just, I can't understand it. I look at my own students posting, both sides of this argument online and kind of fighting this information war internally.
Right.
And I'm sure that it's also being driven by actors outside the country because there's a goal to have us fighting with each other, because if we're fighting with each other, we can't pay attention to them. And so it's almost mind-boggling. We looked at cyber war in the 1970s as being, they're going to shut off our water systems, they're going to play with our electrical grid.
Right.
And we never dreamed that they would use freedom of the press against us.
That's right.
To change hearts and minds.
That's right.
We tried to do that in Vietnam, and they've been far more successful doing it here in the United States than we could have ever imagined.
Yep.
Using our own tools against us.
That's spot on, and I'll just add that a lot of the principles I talked about, in that incident, you can see speed kills, right? So first mover advantage, who's getting their information out and where. It's incredibly siloed, right? Narrow or odd. Like if you're on certain Facebook group chats, you're like, whoa, these alternative realities, like they're very different, right? Because we're in echo chambers in terms of how we get our information. And then you find this idea of how they're able. One thing that I found useful is that I travel a lot for work, and I'm working, and it's interesting what other people who are watching us, just spectators around the world, are picking up. They're picking up very different things. They're pulling out, right? So when they see those protests or they see things, they say, well, maybe we can do that too. Or maybe that's okay because America's doing it. We don't realize that actually we carried a lot of as somebody who stood behind the flag and I continue to stand behind the flag, it's an incredible honor. But we also recognize what great weight that is because people around the world, a lot of these people that I talked about, back to your question about that want freedom and democracy and things that Reagan and others have talked about it, presidents have talked about it for such a long time, when they see some of those things coming out from our media, it's hard for them to distinguish. They think it's a reflection on us overall. So that's a very worrying trend to me.
Thank you very much.
Good, thank you.